At the family reunion, my son leaned close and whispered, "Don't embarrass me tonight." I stayed silent, but deep inside, something broke. He thought I'd walk away quietly. Instead, I invited a surprise guest who left the entire room frozen, in shock, and my son wishing he'd never spoken those words. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. I lived long enough to believe that respect from one's children was not something you had to demand, but something that naturally grew from the years you poured yourself into them. Respect was supposed to be the harvest of love, of sacrifice, of nights spent awake wondering if the money would stretch far enough to cover the bills and still leave a little for their birthday cake. Respect was supposed to be the quiet thank you whispered through years of laughter in the kitchen, of slammed doors in adolescence, of watching them walk into the world wearing shoes you had once laced for them. At least, that is what I had told myself. But life has a cruel way of peeling back illusions in the harshest of moments. The day of the family reunion was supposed to be light. That morning, I had ironed a crisp shirt. The same pale blue one my late wife always said brought out the steadiness in my eyes. It had been 2 years since she passed, and though I never admitted it aloud, I still heard her voice in the quiet moments. She would have wanted me there, with family, showing strength, not drowning in the silence of the empty house. The reunion was my son's idea, or at least that's what I thought. He wanted to gather cousins, uncles, distant relatives, a chance, he said, for everyone to reconnect. I told myself it was a gesture of kindness, maybe even healing, perhaps. He wanted to close the distance that had grown between us since her funeral. Foolish of me, really, to mistake convenience for love. When I arrived, I noticed the shift immediately. The way conversations dipped and then swelled when I walked into the hall. The way my son didn't quite meet my eyes, busying himself with some trivial detail, straightening napkins that didn't need straightening. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief sometimes makes you paranoid. I found a seat at the edge of the long table, listening to the chatter of relatives who spoke of promotions, engagements, vacations I had never been invited to. I smiled where I could, swallowed the lump that often rose in my throat. I kept hearing my wife's voice, "You're part of this family, don't forget that." But the truth was, I already felt like a stranger. It wasn't until dessert that the blow came. My son, leaning close, his voice a sharp whisper against the background of laughter and clinking spoons. "Dad, please, don't embarrass me tonight. Just keep quiet. Don't bring up the past. Don't make this about you." His tone carried the kind of polished politeness one reserves for unwanted guests. His words, though, sliced through me. "Don't embarrass me," as if I were a burden, a child to be managed, a relic dragged into the present only out of obligation. My hands trembled slightly, not from age but from something colder. Recognition that the son I had raised to stand tall was now asking me to shrink. I looked at him then, really looked. The boy I once held in my arms, the man whose wedding I paid for, the father whose children call me grandpa in fleeting visits, and all I saw was a man who wanted me invisible, erased from the narrative he was curating for others. I could feel heat rising in my chest, not anger exactly, but a kind of grief more potent than mourning. My wife's funeral had not broken me, nor had the endless lonely nights, but this quiet rejection by the very blood I had given. It was a wound that bled silently inside. Around me, the table roared with laughter at some cousin's joke. I tried to swallow, but the words wouldn't move down. I thought of the years, the sacrifices, the mortgage payments I had covered when his startup failed, the tuition checks I signed without hesitation, the nights I drove across town to watch his children so he and his wife could have their dinners and weekends away. And now, reduced to an inconvenience, a shadow in his carefully staged life. I didn't respond to him, not with words. What could I have said? That his words felt like a knife twisted in old wounds, that he had already embarrassed himself more than I ever could. Instead, I let the silence fall between us like a curtain. I sat through the remainder of the evening with the poise of a man who had endured worse storms. I answered questions politely, nodded where needed, and let my presence dissolve into the background. They laughed, they toasted, they reminisced without me. My son barely looked my way again. When the final toast was raised, glasses clinking under the warm glow of chandeliers, I felt no belonging, no family, only the quiet weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. And when the laughter swelled, one last time, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of wood against tile was loud in my own ears, but no one else seemed to notice. I stood, straightened my shirt, and without a word, I walked toward the door. I could hear him calling after me, not loudly, not with concern, but with the strained irritation of someone worried about appearances. "Dad, Dad, where are you going?" But I didn't turn. I didn't give him the satisfaction of my eyes, my voice, my hurt. I walked out into the night air, cool and still, and for the first time in years, I realized something had shifted inside me. The man who had poured everything into family had been emptied. What remained was silence, patience, and the cold seed of something sharper. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just got up and walked out of my own family. When I came back home that night, after walking out of the reunion, The silence greeted me like an old companion. The porch light flickered faintly, just as it had for years, refusing to die out completely, as though it too was stubborn about letting go. I paused at the doorway, hand resting on the frame of the house I had built with more than just brick and timber. It wasn't simply a dwelling. It was the vessel of decades of my life, each wall infused with the kind of sacrifice words rarely do justice. I remembered when it was nothing but a stretch of barren land, weeds twisting out of the soil. My wife and I stood side by side, staring at it, imagining walls that didn't exist yet. She had smiled, a soft curve of lips that seemed to draw blueprints in the air. "One day we'll fill this place with noise," she had whispered. And so we did. I worked overtime, picked up shifts others didn't want, and poured sweat into every dollar saved. My hands were rougher then, stronger, and I spent evenings hunched over calculations at the kitchen table of our tiny rented apartment. Day the foundation was poured, I walked the edges like a man patrolling his own dream. I knew then it wasn't just cement settling into earth, it was the first stone of a legacy, a place where children would run, where birthdays would be celebrated, where grief would find shelter. That house became the frame of my family's story. Inside, every corner carried fingerprints of our lives. The dining room table, scratched and dented, had heard more confessions than any church. Arguments erupted there, but so did laughter, long and rolling, the kind that left you clutching your stomach. My son once sat at that table with crayons spread across its surface, drawing lopsided cars and crooked suns. Later, he sat there with college brochures, his brow furrowed as I told him not to worry about the money. "Your only job is to dream," I had said. He believed me then. The living room was painted by echoes of childhood. I could still see him, 5 years old, building a fort out of couch cushions, declaring it his castle. I could hear the sound of him running down the hallway, socks sliding against polished wood, his laughter chasing him like a shadow. Those walls had absorbed the pitch of his teenage voice as it cracked into adulthood, the slam of his door when he thought I didn't understand, and the softer sound of him asking for forgiveness a day later. And then there was the kitchen, my wife's sanctuary. The smell of cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings would waft through the halls like an invitation to joy. She hummed while she cooked, a tune without words, but full of meaning. That kitchen wasn't just for meals. It was where secrets were shared. It was where my son told us he had fallen in love for the first time. It was where later, we sat with him and his fiancée, reassuring them that the house would always be open, that family was bigger than walls, but memories aren't always warm. The house bore witness to sacrifice. I recalled the year I took out a second mortgage, silent about the stress it strapped to my shoulders, just to cover his tuition. I never told him the sleepless nights I endured, the stack of bills I balanced like a fragile tower. My wife noticed, of course. She always did. "We'll manage," she would say, sliding her hand into mine under the weight of all those numbers. And we did. Not because we had enough, but because we had each other. That was the currency of our life. I ran my fingers across the banister that night, tracing the groove where years of hands had worn it smooth. I thought of the time we strung Christmas lights up the staircase, our son barely tall enough to reach the second rung. I remembered his voice shouting, "Higher, Dad, higher," as if I could carry him not just up the stairs but into every height he ever dreamed of. That same banister had steadied him when he stumbled home drunk in college, embarrassed, ashamed. I had said nothing, only guided him gently to his room, because that's what fathers did, carried weight so their children could walk lighter. The walls still held photographs, though some frames now hung slightly crooked. My wife in her wedding dress, her eyes locked on me with the trust of a lifetime. My son, grinning with a missing front tooth, holding up a fish almost too big for his little arms. Later, him in cap and gown, my arm around his shoulder, pride swelling in me like a tide. Photographs are cruel in their permanence. They freeze the love that time sometimes erases from the living dot. As I walked through each room, I felt the air heavier than before, not because of dust or disuse, but because of absence. Absence has a weight. It presses against your ribs until you can hardly breathe. The laughter that once lived here had been evicted, replaced by a silence that followed me from room to room. My footsteps echoed, not against the hardwood, but against memory itself. I found myself in the bedroom, where my wife's side of the closet still smelled faintly of lavender. I had never moved her clothes. Some part of me believed she would scold me if I did, laugh at me for clinging, but I couldn't strip the house of her presence, not when it was all that tethered me to her. My son never understood that. He once suggested I pack things away, start fresh, as though love could be boxed up and put in storage, as though grief was a season you could decide was over. Standing there, I realized that this house, this place I had bled and broken for, no longer belonged to the family it was built for. They had abandoned it, the way they had abandoned me. They had taken the sacrifices embedded in the beams, the nights written in the creak of the floors, and treated them as background noise to their own lives. They forgot the home that had carried them through storms, forgot the father who kept the roof steady while rain lashed outside. I sat in the chair by the window, the one my wife used to occupy when she read late into the night. The moonlight draped itself across the room, making shadows of the photographs. I thought about my son's words at the reunion. his plea not to embarrass him. I wondered if he realized how many times I had swallowed my pride for him. How many times I had chosen silence over dignity, endurance over confrontation. The irony struck me with a bitterness that tasted almost metallic on my tongue. The house hadn't failed us. It had done its job. It had held us, sheltered us, offered itself as a stage for all our joys and despairs. It wasn't the house that had grown cold. It was them. They had walked out long before I did. And now, all that was left was me, a man sitting among the ruins of his own devotion, staring at walls that remembered what people had chosen to forget. It used to be filled with love. Now it echoed with silence. Money has a strange way of disappearing when it is given out of love. You never count it the same way. You don't stack it into neat piles, calculating interest or measuring returns. Instead, you fold it into envelopes, wire it through banks, sign your name on loans, not because you expect it to return, but because you believe it will be remembered. I never saw the money I gave my son as numbers. To me, each dollar was a thread I stitched into the fabric of his future. I remembered the first tuition check I signed. My hand shook, not from doubt, but from exhaustion. I had worked double shifts, for weeks, standing so long at my post that my legs ached through the night. The numbers on the bill stared back at me, mocking the modest balance in my account. But then I remembered the way his eyes had lit up when the acceptance letter arrived. The way he said, "Dad, I'll make you proud." And I thought, what is money compared to that promise? So I signed. I drained what I had promised myself I'd make up the difference, and slipped that check into an envelope with my heart beating fast. The day we dropped him off at college, I walked beside him through halls that smelled faintly of books and ambition. He moved quickly, already talking about classes and friends he hadn't met yet. I carried his boxers heavier than they looked while he carried only excitement. When it came time to leave, he hugged me tight, and his words lingered longer than the embrace. "We'll always be there for you, Dad." It was a promise that felt like a contract signed in blood. I drove home that night with tears blurring the road, but also with the warmth that no amount of overtime could exhaust. Then came the wedding. A beautiful day, though I spent most of it behind the scenes. It was my savings that dressed the tables. With flowers, my years of labor that twinkled in the lights strung across the ceiling. I stood in the shadows, watching him dance with his bride, their laughter carrying above the music. At one point, he walked over, pulled me into a hug so strong it nearly cracked my ribs, and whispered, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." I didn't say what I should have. That repayment wasn't what I wanted. That respect was enough. That remembrance would suffice. I only smiled and told him, "Just take care of her. That's all the payment I need." But the bills did not vanish with the vows. I signed loan after loan, sometimes as guarantor, sometimes as silent rescuer. When their first house fell through, mortgage denied, I put down the down payment myself. I told them it was a gift, but truthfully, it was a sacrifice. I let my own plans for retirement shrink into shadows so theirs could shine. And when he said, "We'll never forget this, Dad," I believed him. Words like that, spoken with sincerity, can fool even the most experienced heart. Years blurred into a rhythm of giving. When their car broke down, I co-signed for the new one. When his business faltered, I wrote a check that cleared debts he didn't dare tell his wife about. When my grandchildren were born, I bought them cribs, toys, clothes, sometimes groceries. When the fridge grew bare, each time I told myself, "This is family. This is what fathers do." And each time I tucked away the receipts in an old drawer, not because I planned to demand repayment, but because a part of me wanted the paper trail of love preserved. Proof that I had carried them when they couldn't walk alone. I can still see the drawer, stuffed with folded statements. The ink faded in some places. Tuition, wedding expenses, mortgage, down payments, car loans, business bailouts. Each slip of paper whispered the same silent refrain. You gave, you trusted, you believed. Those receipts were not records of money. They were chapters of devotion, torn from my life and stapled into theirs. But devotion has a cruel way of turning invisible. At the reunion, when my son leaned in and told me not to embarrass him, I felt those receipts burn in my pocket, though they were miles away in a desk drawer. The contrast struck me with the finality of a slammed door. How could the same man, who once pressed his forehead against mine and whispered, "We'll always be there for you, Dad," now look at me as though I were shame incarnate? How could the son whose dreams I had purchased now ask me to shrink small enough to disappear? It wasn't just ingratitude, it was erasure. The years I had poured into his life had been scrubbed clean, as though my sacrifices were nothing more than background noise to the story he told himself about success. He believed he built it all on his own. The house he lived in, the education he wore like armor, the stability he flaunted, all built on foundations I had quietly laid. And now he wanted me gone, silent, unseen, lest I remind anyone of the truth. There is a peculiar ache that comes when you realize love has been mistaken for obligation, that everything you gave freely has been reclassified as expected, deserved, disposable. I saw it now in his eyes. He didn't think of me as the man who had shouldered his burdens. He thought of me as one more burden to shoulder. And for that, he resented me. I thought of my wife then, her voice soft in memory. One day, they'll understand all you've done. But as I sat in my quiet house, staring at those faded receipts, I realized she had been wrong. Understanding does not arrive on its own. Some people never look back unless you force their eyes to turn. My son had rewritten the past, and in his version, I had no role worth remembering. The drawer full of receipts might as well have been ashes. They were records of love that no one else cared to read. I could run my fingers across them, trace the lines of ink where numbers once terrified me, but they no longer spoke of pride or promise. They spoke of debt, not his to me, but mine to the foolish belief that love would always be honored. The reunion replayed in my mind. His words replayed, "Don't embarrass me." I thought of all the times I had swallowed my pride, all the times I had erased myself so he could stand taller. And now, he had the gall to pretend I had never lifted him at all. That was the true betrayal. Not that he forgot the money. Not even that he dismissed me publicly, but that he had erased the debt I paid with love. After the reunion, I could have chosen to bury the humiliation in silence. That would have been the easier path. The one I had walked for years, swallowing grievances like bitter pills, convincing myself that dignity was preserved in endurance. But there comes a point where silence turns poisonous. Alone in that house, surrounded by memories that had grown heavier than the furniture itself, I began to wonder what, exactly, my sacrifices had amounted to. The drawer of receipts called to me like evidence in a trial yet to be held. And one night I opened it. At first, I sifted through them like an old man chasing ghosts, tuition bills, mortgage papers, loan statements with my signature scrawled across the bottom. Each one was a reminder of how willingly I had tied myself to my son's future. But something gnawed at me. The numbers didn't add up anymore. My modest pension and savings should have allowed me at least some comfort in old age, yet I always felt as though I was running on empty. Where had it all gone? The first clue came when I checked my bank statements. Buried in the lines of transactions was a payment I didn't recognize, deducted monthly, steady as the tick of a clock. At first I thought it was some subscription, some forgotten bill, but when I called the bank, the clerk spoke in a careful, polite tone that made my skin prickle. "Sir, this is a repayment toward a co-signed loan, still active." My heart stilled. I asked her to clarify. She did. Years ago, when my son's business had been gasping for air, I had co-signed on a line of credit. He had promised it was temporary, that the business would bloom, that I'd never even notice. And I hadn't because he had defaulted quietly, and the debt had slithered its way onto my back. For years I had been paying, without realizing, without questioning. That night, I barely slept. I pulled out folders, papers, statements. The next morning, I walked into the bank with a folder under my arm, the way a man carries ammunition. The banker who met me was younger than my son, his face polite but detached. The way professionals look at you when they know you've been played. He showed me the records, laid them out like autopsy photographs. Loans opened in my name. Mortgages with my signature guaranteeing them. Co-signed agreements tied to businesses I never owned. I stared at the papers, my hands steady, my pulse oddly calm. Why wasn't I notified? I asked. "You were, sir," the banker said gently. "Notices were sent, payments were withdrawn, everything was processed legally. It's all here in the records." And there it was, my son's silence weaponized. He had let the payments bleed out of my account like a slow leak, trusting that I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I wouldn't challenge him if I did. After all, wasn't I the father who always covered, always forgave, always understood? But it wasn't just one loan. The banker's records revealed layers of betrayal. A mortgage partially in my name, still unpaid. Credit lines tied to me, never closed. Even a bankruptcy filing that had brushed against my credit, dragging me into shadows I never chose. It was a web, and I was its center. I had been both the safety net and the sacrifice. Not just once, but systematically, over years. I left the bank with copies, papers heavy in my briefcase. Outside, the sun was too bright, the air too sharp. It felt like stepping into a new world, one where trust was a trap and love had been leveraged like collateral. I walked straight to a lawyer's office, a man I had known once through church. He didn't recognize me at first. Years had drawn lines across my face. But when I laid out the papers, his eyes sharpened. He flipped through the pages, his mouth tightening with each one. "This isn't just negligence," he said finally. "It's manipulation. He's tied you to obligations you may never crawl out from. And if he defaults again, he didn't need to finish." I already knew. We spoke for an hour. He explained the legal bindings, the signatures that tethered me, the loopholes my son had slipped through with my unwitting cooperation. Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of the man I thought I had raised. By the end, my lawyer sat back and studied me. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I thanked him, gathered my papers, and walked out with a strange clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't blinded by grief or softened by nostalgia. I saw the betrayal for what it was, not just a careless son forgetting his father's sacrifices, but a deliberate act of erasure, a rewriting of debts onto the one man he believed would never fight back. As I walked back to my car, a thought crystallized inside me, sharp as glass. My son believed me broken. He believed I was too old, too grief-stricken, too weary to notice or to resist. He believed my silence would stretch on forever, and maybe, once, that would have been true. But standing there, clutching evidence of years of manipulation, I felt something stir in me that had been dormant too long. I was not broken, I was trained. A lifetime of sacrifice, of calculation, of survival. These were not weaknesses. They were weapons. My son thought he had buried me under paperwork, under silence. He had mistaken patience for fragility. They thought I was grieving. They forgot I was trained for this. I had not expected to find clarity in betrayal, but clarity came all the same. When the fog of grief lifts, even just slightly, the world sharpens into something you can finally grasp. After my wife's death, I had floated through days like a ghost, content to let time push me forward without asking where I was going. But betrayal has a way of waking a man up. It is both wound and medicine. It burns, but it forces your eyes open. For most of my life, I played the role of provider. Quietly, reliably. I never spoke much of the years I spent in finance, the long days studying risk and credit, contracts and loopholes. To my family, I was just dad, the man who kept the lights on, who signed the checks, who always found a way. What they never understood was that I was not guessing. I was calculating. Every payment, every loan, every mortgage I ever shouldered, I did with the mind of someone who knew the system better than those who tried to exploit it. I had walked through the fire of numbers for decades. I had seen men undone by debts they thought invisible. So when I uncovered the trail of manipulation my son had left, I did not crumble. I reverted. I became, once more, the strategist I had, buried beneath years of fatherhood. The first step was information. I spent days combing through the files I had pulled from the bank, but personal effort wasn't enough. I called in old favors. An accountant I had once mentored, now seasoned with years of forensic work. A lawyer from my past. The same man who had once helped me secure my first mortgage. Even an old colleague from the bank, who remembered me as the quiet man who always spotted what others missed. I did not beg them. I did not ask them for sympathy. I simply presented the facts, the documents, and reminded them that I had once been the man they turned to when the numbers didn't make sense. They didn't see an old man. They saw a professional resurfacing from the shadows. Reports began to arrive, neatly bound, precise, credit histories, defaults, bankruptcy filings, shell accounts, all laid out like autopsy reports on a body long since declared dead. Each one revealed another layer of rot. My son had not simply leaned on me out of desperation. He had structured his life on the certainty that I would absorb the collapse. Businesses failed. Father will pay. Father will pay. Mortgages slipped into arrears. Father will carry the weight. Creditors, circling. Father's silence will shield him. The documentation was staggering. But I read every line with the patience of a man who had once balanced entire ledgers by candlelight. The paper trail was no longer a burden. It was ammunition. Each signature, each withdrawal, each transaction was a weapon I could wield. And with every discovery, something inside me hardened. Love still lived in me. Love for the boy he once was. Love for the son who once pressed his forehead to mine in gratitude. But love, when abused, becomes steel. My silence was no longer submission. It was strategy. I built binders, thick black binders that sat on my desk like weapons of war. Each one labeled loans, mortgages, business debts, defaults. Attached were copies of contracts, notarized statements, timelines drawn in careful ink. I cross-referenced everything, connecting his debts to his current assets, mapping out exactly where his house of cards would fall. The lawyer I consulted reviewed it all, his brow furrowed as he flipped through. "You could ruin him with this," he said finally. I looked him in the eye and replied, calm, unshaken, "I'm not going to ruin him. I'm going to teach him." That was the truth of it. Revenge, for me, was never about spectacle. It wasn't about screaming at him in front of the family or demanding apologies that would only come empty. No, revenge was a quieter art. It was about balance, about turning the very tools he had used against me into instruments of correction, about making him understand that the man he dismissed as frail still held the knowledge that could dismantle everything he thought was secure. So I kept building. I ordered credit reports from agencies, tracked down liens he had hoped would vanish into obscurity, even pulled property tax records that revealed just how close his suburban comfort was to foreclosure. I worked methodically, each night at the same desk where I once helped him with homework, each document stacked with the precision of a chessboard, because that was what it was now, a game of chess, and I had been playing longer than he knew. My son thought himself clever, shifting debts onto me, dodging accountability, assuming I would never notice. But he was playing checkers in a world I had mapped in 64 squares. The metaphor carried me through those nights. I remembered how, as a boy, I taught him chess at that very dining room table. He grew impatient with the game, frustrated that pieces couldn't leap and tumble like in simpler matches. He never learned the patience it demanded, the foresight required. And now, years later, he had carried that same impatience into life, always reaching for shortcuts, never considering the consequence of each move. I considered that as I stacked the binders, their weight both physical and symbolic. He had thought he was outmaneuvering me, shifting pieces when I wasn't looking, but I had always been the one who understood the board. When the reports were complete, when the documentation was ironclad, I sat back and let the coldness settle over me. I was not the grieving father anymore. I was not the man silenced at a reunion, humiliated by whispers. I was something sharper, something quieter, something patient. And in that stillness, I found the words that defined me now, the mantra of a man reborn not in love, but in clarity. You don't play chess with someone who invented the board. The thing about collapse is that it rarely happens in a single moment. From the outside, it looks like sudden ruin, but from the inside, it is a slow unraveling. Threads snapping one after the other until there is nothing left to hold the fabric together. I did not need to strike my son directly. I did not need to raise my voice or slam a fist on a table. All I had to do was step back, remove the invisible support I had been providing for years, and let gravity do its work. The first tremor came in the form of a lone rejection. I heard about it not from him, but from a neighbor who mentioned, casually, that my son had been turned down for an expansion on his business. Strange, the neighbor said. He seemed so confident. I only nodded. I knew why. Without my signature, without my quiet cosigns propping him up, the banks finally saw him for what he was. A risk, a man balancing on debts he had never learned to manage. Soon after, whispers began to follow him. Clients backed out of agreements. Suppliers demanded payment in advance. His business, once his pride, once the centerpiece of his identity, began to teeter. I watched from a distance, driving past his office one evening to see the lights still burning, his car parked out front. I imagined him inside, poring over books that refused to balance, phone pressed to his ear as excuses ran. I did not stop. I did not call. I let the night absorb him. Then came the arguments. His wife's voice carried farther than he realized. On quiet evenings, when the air was still, I could hear echoes from their house. Accusations, sharp and jagged, cutting through walls. You promised this would work, she would shout. His voice, lower, desperate, snapping back. I'm doing everything I can. They thought no one could hear, but silence has a way of carrying truth farther than shouting ever could. I listened, not with glee, but with the detached calm of a man watching storms he predicted finally break. Cars began to betray him too. I passed him once on the side of the road, hood lifted, his tie loosened, his forehead damp with sweat as he cursed the engine that refused to turn. I slowed my car just enough for him to glance up. Our eyes met. For a flicker of a moment, I thought he might wave, might call out. Instead, he looked away, jaw clenched, pretending he hadn't seen me. I drove on, the image of him shrinking in my rearview mirror until he was no more than a shadow swallowed by dusk. But the greatest blow was the house I had once saved for him, the one he had filled with modern furniture and family photographs, began to buckle under its own weight. Letters came first, crisp envelopes from the bank, their logos stark and unforgiving. At first, he hid them. I could tell because his wife began to visit my home, her voice strained but polite, asking if I had heard from him, if I might help him straighten things out. I told her little. I had no advice to give, no comfort that wouldn't sound like hypocrisy. Then the foreclosure notice arrived. It was posted boldly, a scarlet warning nailed to the door of the house that once echoed with my grandchildren's laughter. Neighbors slowed their walks to read it, whispers spreading like wildfire. Pride burns fastest when it is public. My son stopped leaving through the front door. He drove out at night, his car heavy with boxers, shame written across his shoulders even when no one was watching, and I watched, always from the edges, always in silence. I sat on my porch in the evenings, sipping coffee gone cold, and thought about the irony of it all. For years, I had been the quiet rain that kept his fields alive, the unseen nourishment that allowed him to grow. He thought it was his own strength, his own brilliance. He never realized it was my patience, my resources, my sacrifices flowing through his roots. And now, as I withdrew, as I let the clouds part and the ground crack, he discovered the truth. They thought I was the rain. I was the drought. It did not bring me joy, not in the way some might imagine. Revenge is not laughter in the dark, nor is it triumphant declarations. It is quieter. It is the sound of footsteps retreating while the house behind you collapses. It is the calm realization that justice does not always need your hand to push. Sometimes, it only needs your absence. Yet, there was a strange peace in it. Watching his world unravel, I did not feel pity. I did not feel rage. I felt balance. For the first time in years, the scales of sacrifice and consequence tipped back toward equilibrium. My silence was not weakness anymore. It was gravity, steady and inevitable. There were moments, brief flickering moments, when I thought of intervening. When I saw my grandchildren's faces pale with confusion, their eyes asking questions their parents refused to answer. My heart trembled, but I reminded myself I had already given enough. Every intervention, every rescue in the past had only taught him that collapse was optional, that someone would always appear to hold the walls steady. If I stepped in again, I would only reinforce the illusion that he could burn bridges without consequence. No, this time he would learn. So I remained still. I remained silent. I let the drought do its work. As weeks passed, the business closed its doors. The house stood empty, foreclosure complete, its windows blank like eyes that had given up. My son's car disappeared from the driveway, his family scattered, and me. I sat in the same house I had built decades ago, its walls still standing, its roof still holding. Proof that some foundations are laid with more than money. They are laid with truth, with sacrifice that refuses to rot. I touched the receipts in my drawer, not as wounds anymore, but as reminders. Proof that I had given all I could. Proof that I had not failed as a father. They had failed as children. And as I watched the dust gather on the binders of evidence, I knew I was not done. This was not just punishment, it was preparation. The drought was only the beginning. They came back when the silence had grown too loud to ignore. It was evening, the kind where the sky is painted in tired shades of gray and the air feels heavy with unfinished storms. I heard the knock first, not polite, not tentative, but frantic, the kind of knock that carries shame in its rhythm. I opened the door to find my son standing there, his wife beside him, their faces pale and drawn like paper left too long in the sun. "Dad," he started, voice cracking. Can we come in?" I stepped aside without a word. They entered like trespassers, their eyes darting around the house that had not changed while theirs had crumbled. The photographs still hung, the furniture still stood solid, the air still smelled faintly of lavender from the drawer of my wife's things. It was as though time had preserved this place, a cruel reminder of what permanence looked like. We sat at the dining table, the same table where years ago I had signed checks for their dreams, where laughter once spilled as freely as wine. Now it felt smaller, crowded by their desperation. My son leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes searching mine for a softness that wasn't there. "Dad, things have been hard. The business, well, you know, and the house." His voice caught. He pressed his lips together before continuing. "We just need a little help, just alone, just until we get back on our feet." His wife's voice followed, smooth, practiced. "He's trying. You know he is. He's been working nights, talking to everyone he can. The children. They're scared. They miss stability. Please, for them. Do it for the children." I listened. Silence stretched between their words and my stillness. My son shifted, mistaking silence for hesitation. He tried another weapon. "Mom would have wanted you to help us. She wouldn't have wanted the kids to suffer." That one landed like a blade, but I did not flinch. My wife's memory had been their shield for years, invoked whenever they wanted to pierce my defenses. But tonight, her name sounded hollow. A ghost dragged into battle without consent. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as though intimacy could sway me. "Dad, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've leaned on you too much. But we're family, and family forgives. Family helps each other, no matter what." I could see the sweat at his temple, the way his hands trembled despite being pressed tightly together. His wife dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her tears quick to appear, slow to fall. She had learned long ago that pity could loosen purse strings. "Please," she whispered. "You've always been our rock. Don't let us drown now." The room thickened with their desperation, memories swirled with every plea. My son's graduation, his arms around me, whispering gratitude, his wedding night, his promise to repay me. Nights spent in my house, eating meals I had cooked, laughing as though debts didn't exist, and now those same lips twisted the past into leverage, but I remained still. I let the silence grow heavier, pressing down on them until their words faltered. He searched my face for mercy, but found only a mirror reflecting his own ruin. Finally, his tone shifted, sharp, almost angry. "So that's it? You'll just sit there? You'll watch us fall apart?" His wife grabbed his arm, whispering for calm, but he pulled away. "After everything you've done for us, after everything we've been through, you'll just let it end like this?" I stared back unblinking. My silence was not absence anymore. It was judgment. It was the weight of every receipt, every sacrifice, every betrayal stacked high around them. He tried one last time, voice cracking into something raw. "Please, Dad, just say something, anything. Don't leave us like this." I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking softly beneath me, and let the quiet answer him. His face fell, his shoulders collapsing under the truth. He realized then, what I had known all along. Words could not rebuild what he had burned. We sat in that silence until they understood. And when they finally rose, when their footsteps dragged toward the door, I let my voice break the stillness at last. Calm, steady, undeniable. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their creditor. When they returned, it was not with anger but with defeat in their eyes. I could see it in the slump of their shoulders, the hesitation in their knock. I opened the door, and this time, instead of standing aside in silence, I gestured for them to follow me. Not to the dining room, not to the living room, but to the study, the room where my desk sat heavy with binders. They entered cautiously, as though stepping into a courtroom they had not prepared for. I let the silence settle before I opened the first binder and laid it on the desk. Paper, ink, signatures, the story of their lives, written not in memories, but in debt. "This," I said quietly, sliding a document across the wood, "is the loan you defaulted on, the one I've been paying for years." My son stared at it, then at me, his mouth half open, no words coming. Another binder. Here is the mortgage you placed in my name. Still unpaid. His wife shifted uncomfortably, her hand covering her mouth. A third. And here are the bankruptcy filings, the liens, the credit reports. Every shadow you tried to bury has been unearthed. I spoke calmly, almost gently, but the weight of each page was heavier than shouting ever could be. My son's hand shook as he reached for one document, scanning the numbers, the dates, the ink that bore his own handwriting beside mine, his face drained of color. You knew, he whispered. I met his eyes. I always knew. I just chose silence. Until now. The room felt smaller with every revelation. The walls closed in as the timelines stacked against him, proof upon proof that his world had never stood on its own. He had thought my patience meant ignorance. He had thought my grief had made me blind. But now he saw the truth. Every step he took had been watched, every debt recorded, every betrayal catalogued with precision. His wife finally spoke, her voice breaking. Why? Why keep all this? Why not just because I wanted you to see? I interrupted softly. Not just that you failed, but that I knew. That every time you thought you were clever, every time you thought you were hiding something, I was watching, waiting. The silence that followed was thick with realization. Their desperation was not just financial now. It was existential. They understood that the ground beneath them had never been theirs. It had always been mine, and I had just chosen to stop holding it steady. My son dropped his gaze to the desk, his voice hoarse. So what happens now? I closed the final binder with deliberate calm, the sound echoing like a gavel. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift entirely, the power flowing back to where it had always belonged. I leaned forward, my voice steady, final. Let's talk terms. They sat across from me, hands folded, eyes darting between the binders stacked like gravestones on the desk. The air was brittle, ready to snap. My son cleared his throat, searching for some ground to stand on. So, you'll help us. I let the pause stretch before answering, partially, but not as before, not freely. If you want my hand again, you'll accept my conditions. His wife bristled. Conditions? We're family. No, I said evenly. We're debt and creditor, and debts come with terms. I opened a folder I had prepared days earlier. Inside were documents neatly arranged, every word crafted with the precision of a scalpel. I slid the first across the desk. You will make a public apology, not a private whisper, not an excuse. You will stand before the family at the next gathering and say aloud what you've done. The debts, the manipulation, the betrayals. The truth must be witnessed. Their faces tightened. My son muttered, "That's humiliating." I looked at him steadily. Yes, that's the point. The second document followed. You will sign legal contracts. Every cent I offer will be documented, every repayment enforced. There will be no more secrets, no hidden signatures. Transparency, written, and binding. His wife reached for the paper, skimmed it quickly, then scoffed. This is control. Control, I agreed. The very thing you proved you could not handle on your own. A third paper. You will obey financial guidance. Every purchase, every loan, every decision monitored. If you stray, the support ends immediately. My son pushed back in his chair, anger flickering. You're treating me like a child. I let the silence absorb his words before replying, low and calm. You acted like one. Now you'll live as one, until you learn otherwise. The last document was smaller, but heavier. Therapy, I said. Individually, and together. Not just for the money, for the lies, for the way you've carried. Entitlement like an inheritance. You will face yourselves, or you will face ruin. For a moment, the room was nothing but their refusal. I saw it in clenched jaws, in eyes narrowing with pride. His wife hissed. We don't need this, he muttered. We'll find another way. I leaned back, folding my hands. Then find it, but remember, without me, you have nothing left to mortgage, no credit left to burn. This is the only way forward. The silence grew heavy, crushing their defiance beneath its weight. I watched the fight drain from them slowly, like water, slipping through cracked stone. At last, his wife reached for the pen. Her hand trembled as she signed. My son lingered longer, staring at the page, wrestling with the shame of submission. Finally, with a breath that sounded almost like defeat itself, he scribbled his name. I gathered the signed papers, stacked them neatly, and placed them in the binder. The sound of the cover snapping shut echoed like a verdict. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into the drawer and pulled out a check. I held it in my hand, letting the silence stretch once more, letting them feel its weight before I extended it. His fingers brushed against mine as he took it, but I did not release it until I spoke the only words that mattered. Mercy isn't free. The house was silent again. Not the silence of abandonment, but of peace reclaimed. Papers were filed away, contracts locked in drawers, apologies yet to come. My son and his wife had left hours earlier, carrying their shame with them, and for the first time in years, I did not feel diminished in their presence. I felt whole. I moved slowly through the rooms that had once felt heavy with sorrow. The photographs no longer mocked me with memories. Instead, they bore witness to a truth no one could erase. I stopped at one. my wife on our wedding day, her smile steady, her eyes holding promises we had kept. I touched the glass gently, the way a man touches something sacred. For so long, I believed I was alone in carrying the weight of this family, that my sacrifices had vanished into nothing, but now I understood. Sacrifice doesn't vanish. It waits. It waits until silence is sharpened into steel, until patience grows teeth. I sat in her old chair by the window, the one where she used to read late into the night. The moonlight poured across the floor, softer than any lamp, wrapping the room in silver. I imagined her there, watching me with that half-smile she wore whenever I surprised her with strength. I whispered into the stillness, "It's done." There was no triumph in my voice, no gloating, just calm. Justice, after all, isn't about noise. It's about balance restored. My son believed he could erase me, reduce me to an embarrassment, a burden. Now every step he takes will echo with the reminder that I am still here, not as a father to be pitied, but as the foundation he can no longer ignore. I looked around the home I had built, the walls that had cradled decades of love, laughter, and sacrifice. For a time, I thought they had become tombstones of happier years. Tonight, they felt like sentinels, standing firm, unbroken, exactly as I had intended when I first laid the foundation. I thought of the words my son once whispered, "We'll always be there for you, Dad." Empty now, but I no longer needed them. I had given him enough chances to honor that promise. What he gave me in return was betrayal, and what I gave him back was not vengeance dressed in anger, but justice cloaked in patience. On the table beside me lay a single rose, left from the garden my wife once tended. I lifted it, breathed in its faint, lingering fragrance, and let the petals remind me of her hands. Gentle, careful, strong. Justice, I realized, wore the scent of roses this year. I leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling, the quiet pressing in, not as a burden but as comfort. My story, our story, was no longer about loss. It was about endurance. About showing that kindness is not weakness, that silence is not surrender. It is patience, weaponized. And as the night settled around me, I knew this truth above all. They wanted me gone. Now, they can't move without me.